it's pretty clear that whoever is the next president is going to have to deal with some sort of US government debt crisis. And I'm concerned about how that response is going to be, regardless of which candidate wins. So, for example, Trump, in his case, when there was a major economic crisis in the form of, what happened economically as a result of lockdown policy and because of COVID-19, the person he and his the person that he and his administration reached out to was Larry Fink of BlackRock, who implemented something we can get into later that some researchers have called the going direct reset, which was basically a way to put money from QE directly in the hands of the private sector instead of public entities, sort of like it had been done before. And arguably that resulted in a massive wealth transfer, and BlackRock didn't really use that money to help Main Street at all. They used it to buy shares in their own ETFs, among other things. And then Kamala, in her case, her entire economic team is essentially led by former BlackRock executives. And that was also true for the Biden administration. So essentially BlackRock, which was also played a major role in sort of developing the bailouts in the 2008 economic crisis, which was under Obama, right? Will likely be developing the response for whatever this, coming economic crisis is, regardless of who gets in office. If we look at, the policy actions of the people running, who they turn to in a time of crisis, or who is running their economic team, that seems increasingly likely. So that is why I'm very concerned, I guess I would say, about BlackRock in particular, because they seem to be the people that the government turns to, regardless of whether a Democrat or Republican is in office. And, they have sort of a history of really affecting wealth transfers during these crises at a time when, they're supposedly developing or helping develop policy meant to bail out Main Street. They end up sort of affecting massive bailouts for Wall Streets. And of course, the people that BlackRock are trying to generate profits for ultimately. And the other thing that I'm really concerned about as it relates to, a coming economic crisis is that I think we're going to see a major effort to saddle American consumers with programmable, surveillable money and seizable money. And so, of course, a lot of people for years now have been very concerned about central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. But there are also things issued by the private sector, like stable coins, for example, that are just as programmable and surveillable and seizable as CBDCs are. So I think it's very likely, in the event of a major debt crisis or some sort of crisis that damages significantly regular Americans' purchasing power, there will be an effort to onboard Americans onto one of those two versions of programmable, surveillable money. So it's possible, if Kamala wins, we could see a CBDC or something like that. But in the case of Trump, he's sort of come out in favor of stable coins. He did that recently at his speech at the Bitcoin conference earlier this year. And, stable coins are just as programmable and surveillable and seizable as CBDCs in theory are. And I think those, as people have rightly pointed out, are a threat to our financial privacy and ultimately our financial freedom. So I think people should be focusing not just on CBDCs, but also, these other digital currencies that have the potential to offer those same, Orwellian functionalities to the people, issuing them and producing them. And some of those prominent stablecoins, like Circle, for example, have major alliances with BlackRock, and BlackRock has a minority stake in them, and have, said in their some of their SEC filings that, the stablecoins can be used to manipulate the price of Bitcoin, for example.
All right, we've already, here in the opening minutes, we put a lot of things on the table. I want to start now piecing them together into a worldview that somebody that doesn't have your depth of knowledge, where they can begin to understand how this all pieces together. So me, as somebody on the outside of this, I look at it, I'm way more worried about whether Republicans or Democrats get into office based entirely on what their economic policy is. You're really the first person that's been clear in saying, no, you're looking at the wrong level of analysis. you need to understand that they're both going to the same people to come up with their policies. So whatever promises you hear, that's ultimately not going to matter. So what I want to understand is if BlackRock is really where we should be paying attention, if Larry Fink is who they're both basically going to go to, or Larry Fink affiliated entities or people, what is BlackRock's agenda? What do they want?
Yeah, so I think there's things that we can look at as far as BlackRock is concerned that sort of give us clues as to what their agenda may be. And the most concerning thing to me about that, as it relates to people like Larry Fink, is that Larry Fink is on record saying things like markets don't really like democracies because they're messy. Markets like totalitarian governments. And Larry Fink is someone who's been very obsessed with risk management most of his career and sees essentially free democracies and arguably also a free market in some senses as generating more risk than perhaps he would like to handle. So when you're able to sort of control and centralize both markets and governments, you're able to control the amount of risk that's there. And so maybe that's good for asset managers like Larry Fink, who are obsessed with this kind of stuff. But for regular people, ultimately it reduces the amount of freedom that we would have. So I sort of see Larry Fink as someone who's looking to centralize power and centralize wealth. And obviously that has major impacts on regular Americans and the people that aren't necessarily in the oligarch class or in the top 1% that would benefit from those types of policies.
Whoa. Okay. That is extremely direct. Okay. So you have somebody who understands this is about risk mitigation, that a democratic government is going to have a lot more volatility. I mean, even as I think about America having this moral standing in the world, sort of being the world's cop, but every 4 years we have this sort of violent whiplash from one policy direction to the other. I've often thought about how jarring that must be to other world leaders. And so for better or worse, I can actually see what you mean if somebody is investing in the marketplace and they want to make sure that they have a predictable level of risk so that they can not completely control the outcomes, but that they can narrow the band of outcomes so that they don't have this gigantic potential downside. And the way that we get that is totalitarian top-down control. Okay. That's a very clear thesis. Now the question becomes, how are they going about doing it? What are the mechanisms?
Well, I think this is something that's much larger than just BlackRock specifically, but in terms of looking at what BlackRock has done in terms of U.S. fiscal policy, I think it's important to sort of look at their role in, the '08 crisis, which began the policy of quantitative easing, and later on they were called upon by the Trump administration to help develop COVID fiscal response. But actually it began before then. So in the fall of 2019 at Jackson Hole, and this is also, should point out, this is based on the very excellent research of John Titus of the YouTube channel Best Evidence. Essentially, this document was presented by BlackRock to central bankers at Jackson Hole. It was called Going Direct is what they called it. And basically the idea was to have what was generated via quantitative easing, not just go to public sector affiliated entities, but also directly into the hands of the private sector, i.e. Wall Street. And that was essentially what was proposed. And this begins to be implemented well before COVID, when the repo market goes a bit haywire. At the end of 2019 and sort of continues through up until COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, at which point there's a lot of calls between Larry Fink and Steve Mnuchin and other top figures and the economic team of the Trump administration. And then they begin to basically affect this policy or really supercharge this policy and go direct even more. So there's a lot of, things that are happening in terms of economic policy that ultimately resulted in what we're dealing with now, I guess, debasement of U.S. American consumer purchasing power. But a lot of this money at a time when there were lockdowns and there was really very little economic activity going on, they're being given all of this, people like BlackRock asset managers are being given all of this money, and then they go And instead of helping out Main Street, they go up and buy up all the assets. They buy shares in their own ETFs, for example. And basically what happened during COVID was a massive wealth transfer. And if you look at the statistics of it, the top 1% in the United States benefited hugely during COVID, but the rest of us did not. Maybe some people got stimulus in that, but a lot of the consequences downstream of those policies have resulted in this inflationary situation we're in and a lot of other, economic issues that people are dealing with. And so BlackRock sort of, I would argue, oversaw, these wealth transfers sort of, to the benefit of Wall Street and not Main Street. And it seems like, if there is another crisis coming down the pike, which it seems there is, BlackRock is likely to do essentially the same thing, whatever policy they help design. And it really should be a point of public discussion why BlackRock has so much influence over what the Treasury Department does or what the Federal Reserve does. And really, as far as US COVID fiscal policy is concerned, which, by the way, even though that was started under Trump, a lot of this continued through into the Biden administration, who, again, Biden's top economic people are former BlackRock executives. Why is this particular asset manager on Wall Street so embedded with the development of US fiscal policy, which at times when that fiscal policy is meant to help regular Americans, it has not been doing that when BlackRock is involved. And really, this is something that most Americans don't even know happened,
All right. So this is begging a really interesting question, which is the idea of going direct sounds awesome. Like if I'm an individual person and you're going to do quantitative easing, which for anybody watching this that doesn't know that, it's printing money. You're injecting money into the system. Yay. Which is actually terrible. I have a whole thing on that. We'll get to that later. But just for now, so the Fed is printing money. It's putting it into the system. Now, putting it into the system via treasuries or bonds, that's lame because ultimately that's the people that hold those assets, they get richer. The average person does not hold those assets, and therefore you're bypassing the middle class, let's call it, the average person. So I always thought, oh man, that's a terrible way to do it. So I would probably have fallen for, let's go direct. Let's just give the people the money. So how is it that by going direct, if I'm understanding the mechanism there, where we're giving you a stimmy check, it's going directly to you, it's in your name, you get a check cut to you. How does that facilitate the wealth transfer more rapidly?
Maybe I didn't explain that exactly well, but the idea of going direct isn't so much that no, not at all. And it's also, again, this is the work of John Titus. And so I'm sort of giving it, describing his work. So I may not be doing the best job in explaining it either. But as I understand it, it was about putting the money not just in public sector linked entities, but also to the private sector, i.e. Wall Street banks directly. So instead of Wall Street banks trying to get some of this, QE generated money or funds or whatever, having to go to a public sector entity to obtain them, they just receive it directly.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily going to regular Americans directly. It's not going directly from, money creation to regular Americans. It's going, instead of being just, the money generated is going to these public sector entities to be distributed, it's going directly to the private sector. So they don't have to get it from the public sector entities. It just goes straight to them. So it facilitates, they don't really have to do the public-private partnership thing to get their hands on it anymore. They just receive it directly. They take out the middleman, I guess, from their perspective.
Okay, and what is that mechanism? So I understand when the Fed is buying bonds, that's very clear. It's an easy way to get things into the system. But if they're just giving the money to the banks, how is that explained or recognized on a P&L? Like, I don't understand how that makes its way.
To describe the exact mechanism, again, I would refer you to John Titus or his work, his article on going direct on the Solari report, which you can view for free. It's very well documented and describes all of that in detail. And he is, I'm just sort of pointing out his research because I think it's very important as it relates to BlackRock and what their impact on COVID fiscal policy response is. But again, for those very in-depth, explanations of what the mechanisms are and how going direct has happened, I would definitely encourage you to either have him on or read his work because it's forensic, very detailed, and he makes just a complete completely airtight case for what happened as it relates to BlackRock and going direct in COVID fiscal response.
Got it. Okay, so I will make my best guess right now, but if going direct means that I'm the Fed and I'm giving money directly to banks still, even if they want to do fractional reserves, they are going to have to get the money into somebody's hands somewhere. Now, you mentioned earlier that they were buying their own ETFs. So,
Yeah,
but it's my understanding the banks don't have ETFs. A company like BlackRock obviously would have ETFs.
they
So
do. Yeah.
would somewhere in the going direct philosophy, is money ending up getting sent directly to BlackRock, or are they borrowing money from the banks who are getting it directly from the Fed?
Well, in BlackRock's case, there was a funding facility set up. There were several set up during COVID, but there were a couple of them, I think two, that were essentially given to BlackRock to manage. And again, this is a policy that BlackRock wrote well before COVID about what the Fed should do during the next downturn. And then the Fed implements that plan exactly well before COVID-19. And then when COVID-19 happens, they sort of supercharge the policy and then develop these funding facilities allegedly for bailing out Main Street as a result of lockdown policy. And then BlackRock is directly managing a lot of those funds.
Woo. Okay, so I'm going to lay out my understanding of BlackRock, how they work, tie that to what I've just heard you say. This is all very distressing. Okay, so here's my understanding of the way that BlackRock works. BlackRock says, hey, boys and girls, invest your money with us, and we are going to do things like ESG investing. So we're going to, because when you, dear person, investing your 401k with us, you actually will get voting rights in some of these companies that you now own things in. But what we're going to do is we're going to aggregate all of those rights, and we're going to go in on your behalf, and we're going to push for ESG is an easy one. So they themselves, it's not like they had the money and they're investing their own money. They're actually aggregating the capital of people that are investing with them, and they're then aggregating their voting rights. Cool. That was already distressing enough. Now, what I hear you saying is that through this going direct policy, the Fed is going, hey, BlackRock, you guys know how to invest money. So as a way to get this stimulus into the economy in a way that will really stimulate Main Street, we're going to give it to you. You guys will know where to invest that money. You'll know how to aggregate the voting shares and really be able to do something wonderful for this country. Now, if BlackRock were doing something wonderful for this country, we'd be in great shape. But if BlackRock is doing something that isn't wonderful, we're now in a really bad spot. Do I have the gist of this correct?
Yeah, I would say that's fair. And I think now it's perhaps different than in times past where you have, in the case of Trump, Larry Fink used to be, Trump's personal money manager. And, Trump is on record saying that Larry Fink made him a very large amount of money as a result of that partnership. And then in the case of Biden and Kamala, you have, basically their economic policy, Bidenomics, or what will become Kamalanomics or whatever, essentially being designed by former BlackRock executives as well. So, if this is what they did during COVID, and we can look at, the other things that BlackRock has done as it relates to U.S. fiscal policy in the past, it seems like that's what we can expect, regardless of who wins in November. If the next 4 years brings us some sort of economic crisis, which it seems likely that there will be some sort of economic event. You have people like the former Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, saying that it's very likely the next president is going to deal with the U.S. government debt crisis, for example. So, this isn't something I'm just speculating on. There's like major politicians that say we should very much expect some sort of economic crisis to come on the scene over the next, 4 to 5 years. And with, with Trump having a policy record of putting BlackRock at the helm when there is a economic crisis, and then Kamala and Biden, having BlackRock run their economic policy, either way, this is an entity that we should be looking at and scrutinizing, because it's very likely they will be developing the fiscal response once again to whatever that crisis is. And they don't have our best interests at heart.
Yeah. All right. So if you had to look at the outcome of the system that's being used right now, which again, even for my own sake, just to recap, a crisis happens. There's a debate to be had as to whether there should be a response or not. But right now, the MO is a crisis happens. The Fed steps in to stabilize the market. The way, given previous administrations have handled this, the way that they've started now getting that money into the hands of quote unquote Main Street is by using BlackRock to quote unquote know how to best direct that money. And they are, again, just judging it by the outputs of the system. What they're actually doing is facilitating a massive wealth transfer from the average American. It's actually broader than that, but we'll just keep it simple. The average American to what people call the elites. That word is sort of getting weird.
Yeah, sure. A lot of those words have gotten weird recently, but yes, the 1% of the 1%, to go back to sort of Occupy Wall Street lingo or something like that, the very top.
The business world is changing at light speed. Market shifts, AI revolution, rising global tension. There is a new obstacle every day. A lot of businesses are struggling to keep up, but some are also thriving. So what are the ones that are thriving doing? They're using NetSuite by Oracle. Over 38,000 forward-thinking businesses use it to turn rapid change into fuel for growth. With NetSuite, you get one source of truth, real-time insights, and closed books in days, not weeks. So if you're serious about turning uncertainty into opportunity, NetSuite is the tool to do it. Speaking of opportunity, download the CFO's Guide to AI and Machine Learning at netsuite.com/theory. The guide is free to you at netsuite.com/theory. That's netsuite.com/theory. Okay, so if you judge a system by its outputs and say a system is designed to do what it actually does, then we have created a system that is designed to leverage a crisis to transfer wealth. Very interesting. How are they doing this in plain sight?
What exactly do you mean by that? Like, how did BlackRock get away with that during COVID?
How did they get away with it during COVID? How is it that I think your expectation would be that when the next crisis happens, that it's going to happen again?
Yeah, well, I think when a crisis is happening, people tend to have emotional responses and tend to be coming from a place of fear. And that tends to prevent people from thinking critically or calmly or rationally about situations or about policies. And so a lot of, during COVID, obviously a lot of focus was on COVID-19 itself, on the biosecurity situation, not just so much on the financial situation. But for example, if there was a major crisis going forward that would greatly impact Americans' ability to engage in economic activity or have their purchasing power, close to wiped out or something, I think you would see a lot of people really beg for any policy response. Solve this crisis now, we need something, and not really have people think about what is the best policy response to this kind of crisis. People aren't going to think calmly and bring everything to the table. And it's very unlikely there will be some sort of calm, open public debate about it. Generally, what happens is that the government says people are scared and emotional. They clamor for some sort of solution from the government, and the government offers some sort of solution. And, like with COVID-19, BlackRock anticipated the next downturn about a month before the repo market started going haywire, and presented to central bankers, this is the policy you should implement during the next downturn. And it's very possible that BlackRock is working on policy papers, for central bankers or other people in the U.S. government about what policy should be implemented if, this type of crisis happens or that type of crisis happens. It seems like they seem to be designing the policies, I guess. And they've, had in the Biden administration over the past 4 years, they've been leading his former BlackRock executives have been leading his economic team, bringing us to where we are now, and likely what will influencing what will happen over the next couple of years, whenever or up until this crisis emerges. So it seems, you know, very likely that they'll be, dominating, fiscal response again. And then people, because they're not really aware of how this is developed, or really, there's just not a lot of media coverage about, for example, the role of BlackRock in the Biden administration, or in, on Kamala's economic team specifically. I've seen very little coverage, if any, of that. Recently, maybe a few blips here and there of when those people are appointed, but nothing significant beyond that. And then, of course, there was very little scrutiny of U.S. COVID fiscal response, I think, as well. And it's just sort of written off as this is what the government had to do to respond to the crisis in a lot of situations. But I don't think that's necessarily true, because, again, that fiscal response began well before, COVID was declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization, preceding that by like several months, right? So I don't know. I think it's a complicated situation. It's complicated to anticipate what will exactly happen. But again, history tends to repeat itself in these cases. And the fact that you have BlackRock so embedded with the Democrats specifically, and also have this historical precedent with Trump when he was in office last time, it seems very likely that they'll be doing this again. So I guess my role in this is to try and generate awareness so we can have a discussion before that time of crisis, when people are emotional and afraid and concerned about their money, about whether we should be having BlackRock at the helm of this when the next crisis emerges. I would say no.
Yeah. Okay. So let's ask the obvious question. Who should be in charge in that moment? Who do we put in charge of fiscal policy in times of
Well,
crisis or otherwise?
I don't necessarily have the best answer to that, I guess, because I think our current system, specifically as it relates to, the U.S. Treasury Department, has consistently been a revolving door for the last several decades with Wall Street. And like Goldman Sachs, for example, has had very significant treasury or former Goldman Sachs executives have held very prominent roles at the Treasury when crises have emerged. So as an example, you have one of the top guys at Goldman Sachs, Robert Rubin, being a key figure in the Clinton administration's economic policy as Treasury Secretary, and helping engineer the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which creates, arguably the 2008 financial crisis, when George W. Bush's Secretary Treasury at the time the crisis happens is Henry Paulson, another former top guy from Goldman Sachs, that allegedly told members of Congress if they didn't bail out the banks that martial law may be declared in the United States, for example. And then when the COVID fiscal response happened, Steve Mnuchin is a former top Goldman Sachs executive as well. So as far as, the big parties, Democrat and Republican, they tend to appoint people to Treasury that come from these top Wall Street banks that have a history of predatory and arguably criminal behavior. And so, I think there needs to be a much larger structural change, I guess, to prevent that type of revolving door policy, if we're going to see any sort of meaningful fiscal response to a crisis that actually does take, the needs of regular Americans into account. Because historically, that is not what has happened. And the people that come to Treasury tend to have the best interest of Wall Street at heart, and not the best interest of regular Americans at heart. And I think, again, that's sort of a phenomenon that's not exclusive to Treasury either. You have this type of revolving door phenomenon in really most aspects, if not all, of the U.S. government, where you sort of have regulatory capture, of the people supposedly regulating those industries. The industries themselves tend to have put their top people, at least these days, into those major regulatory positions through this revolving door phenomena. So I think we need to find a meaningful way to stop that before we can expect that, major government fiscal response would be designed with the interest of regular Americans at heart, with Main Street at heart and not Wall Street at heart.
Okay, the question becomes, how do we do that? So walk me through, just so that we're not talking abstract stuff, we're really bringing it down to earth. What are the interests of Main Street or the average American?
Well, I think regular Americans would like to stop having their money stolen from them or being misused on things where it's basically being sent to enrich multinational corporations, particularly in the war industry, where you have a lot of, there's been a lot said over the past several years, decades really, about the military industrial complex and how a lot of the wars that U.S. empire goes to start in other countries
Whitney,
generates a
I'm
windfall of
gonna
profit.
stop you. I'm gonna stop you really fast, just because you know this stuff so well, that you'll fractal into 10 more extremely valid issues. But I want to start with, you just said regular Americans want to stop their money being stolen from them. I will say, I don't think the average American realizes that their money is being stolen. Whenever I bring that up, I feel like I'm screaming into the void. So how exactly are Americans' dollars being stolen from them?
Okay, I would say it's going to things that are not actually building necessary infrastructure or
Do you mean
meeting
tax?
Americans' needs.
So money's being taken
Well,
from them via tax and just
yeah,
misspent?
so yeah, I think taxpayer money has been people taxpayer wealth and the money brought in through taxes has been misused and essentially stolen for a very long time. If you look at the work of Catherine Austin Fitts and Mark Skidmore, for example, they noted that like $21 trillion of U.S. taxpayer money essentially was stolen, and they can't really explain what happened to it. So that alone is very
When
significant.
let me ask, is taxation in and of itself theft?
Um, I mean, I think under the current system, because if anyone's familiar with my work in my books, for example, I sort of argue that our government has been overtaken by this network of organized crime and intelligence agencies that have essentially fused their operations and did so in the immediate post-World War II era. And I think financing their operations when they're at the helm is not good, and that the fact that our money is being taken from us ostensibly to provide services to us, and if you believe in the development agenda abroad, the rest of the world. But we know, if you look into it, that that's not actually what is happening. This money is being used to benefit this particular group that has taken control of our institutions and is very corrupt. I think in that case, yes, it's not good at all. In an ideal system, perhaps I'd have a different opinion, but that's not the system we have as it is right now. So I think, in this situation, we need to really look at how our taxpayer money is being spent. And a lot of it is spent on weapons. A lot of it is being sent to other countries with no, stipulations on how that money is used, no oversight. An insane amount of money was spent on quote unquote nation building during the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, for example, with really nothing to show for it. And arguably, and some people have really effectively argued that it was really a money laundering operation at the end of the day, a way to sort of take taxpayer money and then have it go to the hands of these contractors and other entities, and it ends up elsewhere with nothing to show for it in these particular situations. And I think there's plenty of waste and plenty of examples also in the US domestically where contractors have been given taxpayer money to do things and they don't actually do the things that they're supposed to do. And there's really very little accountability for those things when they happen because a lot of people aren't really aware or really follow up on where their taxpayer money is going. And there's a lot of trust that I think people have placed in congressional representatives that they're going to do that due diligence for them. But most people in Congress are multimillionaires who are funded by billionaires and multi-billionaires and tend to have the interests of those people at heart and not exactly, the regular Americans who were in a very different economic situation than them at heart. And so I think also, over the past several decades, we've also had the situation of, outsourcing our industry, to other countries, beginning during, or really not exactly sure where to pinpoint it, but several decades ago, and that has also obviously had a major impact on the United States as well. And I think there's a major effort from the Silicon Valley crowd, oligarchs of which fund both parties, to sort of onboard I guess you could say, the American people into sort of this new system that's coming into place, where it's sort of very focused on, or this basic, I guess, sort of this coming together of digital IDs, digital wallets, UBI. A lot of these things are sort of being slowly developed and sort of like promoted to people. But I think ultimately, you would only have that type of situation where UBI is necessary.
I just want to make sure that we go point by point right now. Okay, so all of that makes sense to me. But I want to go back, because when I think about what the interests of the average American are, it's, I want to be able to take care of my family. I want things to come in at a reasonable cost. I want to be able to save for the future. I want to leave something for my kids, and I want to make sure that my kids have a better future than I have. I feel like if you have that for the vast majority of any nation, I literally think it's completely agnostic. I think that's just what humans crave.
Sure.
If you have that for people, you will have a healthy, thriving society. Assuming we're in agreement with all of that, even if you're BlackRock and you're super greedy, it does not make sense to hollow out the middle class, because eventually, as history teaches us, they come for you. And when they come for you, they come with pitchforks and guillotines, and it's not a good look. So what is it about this moment where the elite are so deranged that they are, from where I'm sitting, playing with fire? Do they just think that we're so stupid that we'll never rebel? Are they counting on this time will be different because they have more control? I don't understand why they would do this.
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly why, but I think it's important to say that at least in my opinion, I think where the powers that be, however you want to define that, are taking people is essentially leading us to some sort of two-tier society where there is really no need for a middle class, and it's really more accurately described as like a neo-feudal style society, where you have a large underclass managed by sort of this more elite group that would do the managing. And I think it really falls under what some people have referred to as technocracy, sort of this idea of more of like a scientific dictatorship. And there's actually this prominent figure from the Club of Rome named Dennis Meadows, and the Club of Rome is an entity that has a very intertwined history with groups that have become infamous over the past several years, like the World Economic Forum, for example. But Dennis Meadows essentially said something to the effect that, for the good of people and the planet and the economy, and in his words, that it was going to be necessary to either reduce the world's population so that people could have freedom and use resources the way they want, or that there would have to be a scientific dictatorship imposed on 8 billion or 7 billion people in order to ensure accurate allocation of resources and all of this stuff by a educated, technocratic, scientific elite. And there are some thinkers in Silicon Valley, like Eric Schmidt, for example, who wrote a book on AI with Henry Kissinger, that essentially say that there's going to be this sort of future brought to us by AI, where there will be the class of people that understand how AI works, that program and maintain it. And then there will be this underclass, really, they don't say underclass, but I would say that, of people who AI acts upon, who can't understand what AI is doing to them. And eventually, because of their dependence on AI, will become cognitively diminished and mentally unable, essentially, to make decisions for themselves without AI's help. And there's a lot of other indications, I would argue, whether it's UBI, which again is going to be for not, I don't think, the top oligarchs in Silicon Valley, like Bill Gates and Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel, are going to be receiving UBI. I think it's intended to be for other people that aren't necessarily in that economic tier. I think it's very likely you're going to see, if these people succeed in their designs, really more of a two-tier society without any sort of need for a middle class. And so I think that's part of why it's been happening. And I think, as to why they might be playing with fire, I think perhaps they're confident that they have a lot more, it's much easier to manipulate people now than perhaps in times past. For example, there was a 2014 research study that was funded by the US Air Force that was about studying how to use social media to control people like drones. Which I think is a very disturbing research proposal in and of itself. But basically this idea that you could use social media networks by tailoring what information people see and don't see down to the individual based on data mined about them off of the internet and then analyzed by various algorithms to basically, essentially mind control people, and in the world, in the words, I guess, of that Air Force proposal. And other militaries around the world have spent millions upon millions of dollars over the past decade plus researching how to manipulate people on social media platforms. So I think it's very possible that they think they can manage it, since a lot of discourse has become increasingly online, and that they can really alter how people perceive reality to unprecedented degrees. And another thing that's brought up in this book by Schmidt and Kissinger talks about, eventually people won't be able to know what's real and what's not, either pointing to things like AI deepfakes and things like that. But what if these deepfakes are wielded by the state to manipulate people? And what if we're led to believe that things happened when they didn't happen? This can be a lot of the fear mongering about deepfakes is when it's in the hands of, an alleged cyber criminal or someone like that. But, there's states around the world that have an arsenal of these digital weapons that are meant to manipulate us in our perception of reality and what's real. And if you can, use AI or other means to control how people perceive reality, you can control their behavior and a lot of other things. So I think they're confident in that. And obviously there's probably other things that I'm leaving out, but that's, sort of what comes to mind, at least at first for me, when in regards to that question.
Is that all? One of my notes is, this is dark. This is very dark. So that I can get a barometer on your worldview, let me ask you, which of the following scenarios would be better? AI comes into existence. It has what, from our perspective, is godlike intellect. It really does know where best to allocate resources to people to maximize human flourishing. But you have to completely submit to the algorithm. Okay, so human flourishing maximized, yay, but you have no autonomy. You do what the algorithm tells you to do. Or the sort of messiness of the human experience, freedom first, you have every right to make stupid and self-destructive decisions. But you don't get to take advantage, obviously, of the algorithm's brilliance. Which of those two would be better?
Yeah, I am definitely human first. In that, when you put it like in these two, specific situations, I think it's kind of dangerous for all of us to, or all of us, a lot of us, to outsource our creative ability to AI, have AI create for us, because essentially when you're not performing those activities yourselves, it's sort of falls under, if you don't use it, you lose it paradigm. So like a lot of us don't really do mental math anymore because most people have a calculator in their smartphone, for example. And so, you don't use that ability, eventually you lose it. So what happens if AI becomes, the main generator of creative content, and people forget how to make art because they haven't done it in so long, and things like that? I think it's possible. I know there's people I've talked to who I think are very intelligent that argue for sort of a middle scenario between the two you pointed out. I personally tend to fall in a more sort of like, I prefer for the analog future to a purely digital future personally. But I think there's a way to do it where we don't really have this situation where the AI algorithm is running our lives and we don't have any agency anymore. I think that's very dangerous. And I think also there's been a lot of hype about AI and its ability to reach that sort of godlike intellect level. I think it's very possible that you could have that essentially faked by some entity, and they could claim that, which has happened in the past. You had a Google engineer or perhaps ex-Google engineer a few years ago, attempt to say that a chatbot that he was working with was sentient, and it was not. So there's the possibility that someone could come out with that story, and if it was widely adopted and enough people said it was, it could be believed to be so, and when it actually be that. And in that type of scenario, I think that's dangerous because it sort of gives this Wizard of Oz functionality, for example, to the government. We made this policy, you hate it, and but the computer said so, so that's why we did it. It's the computer's fault, it's not our fault. It's a way to sort of offshore responsibility onto the algorithm and away from the people at the top. And I don't really think that's the way to go personally. But I'm not trying to say like eliminate AI and don't use it. I personally am not into it, but I have a lot of friends that are. And so I'm not trying to be like that negative about it in that sense. But I also think this whole idea that we should surrender ourselves to the algorithm because it's so much more intelligent than us, which is sort of implicit in that Eric Schmidt Kissinger book. Yeah, I definitely don't agree with that at all, because I think humans should not surrender their agency. And I think it's sort of in that scenario I sort of just laid out, if it's overhyped and it's claimed that it reached that, people could surrender their agency to something that isn't actually possessing this godlike super intelligence, but have just been told it is. And I think, that potentially could be very dangerous.
Yeah. So I'm definitely a techno optimist. There's no doubt about that, but I fully acknowledge all of the risk there. Okay, before we totally go over to the future and where all this stuff is going, I want to re-anchor back around debt. So I'm one of the people that is extremely worried about an economic event. We don't have to call it collapse, but certainly I look at the debt and I say, this is just completely unsustainable. You cannot add $1 trillion of debt every 100 days. That's ridiculous. And the fact that people are acting like we can do this forever is, every alarm bell I have is going off. I don't know how to get people to take this seriously, but I would love to know, do you think the debt is a real problem? And is it something that people should really stop and address?
Yeah, I think debt is a very real and serious issue. And the amount of debt the US government has accrued, I think, is a testament to the poor fiscal management of the US government, and not just the executive branch, but Congress as well. And it's been going on for a very, very very long time, and not a lot has been done about it. And really, in the post 9/11 era, the amount of debt that, the US government has taken on has just absolutely ballooned when you compare it to previous decades. And I think a lot of that has to do with the foreign wars that the US government has engaged in, including ones that aren't formally declared, in this sort of effort to expand, the military empire abroad and sort of maintain that hegemony and dominance. And historically, a lot of that was also directly related to dollar hegemony. The petrodollar system, which now we know has essentially been on the way out. But a colleague of mine, Mark Goodwin, put out a book a few years ago about this idea of the Bitcoin dollar system, and this idea that the US government would sort of use Bitcoin and create the system that's like an analog to the petrodollar system, where, because most people, when Bitcoin is purchased, usually it's done with, by buying dollars first, in order to purchase Bitcoin, for example. And in that type of situation, you'd be just like in the case of, the petrodollar, where, the price of oil it's priced in dollars. You're generating artificial demand for dollars to buy some sort of energy commodity or energy asset. And Bitcoin sort of is an energy asset at the end of the day. It's moving, essentially attempting to create the same system, but instead of with oil, with Bitcoin. And most of the Bitcoin holdings in the world are concentrated in the United States, and the US government itself is one of the biggest holders of Bitcoin in the world. So I think there's sort of this effort there to do that. And this was actually implicit in Trump's speech that he gave at the Bitcoin conference a few months ago, sort of saying that's what he sort of saw utility in Bitcoin for, in a sense. And but I think also that has a lot of causes a lot of complications when it relates to the ethos of Bitcoin, which was originally about stopping irresponsible central bank policy and fiscal policy. The idea that you would yoke Bitcoin to the US dollar instead of using it to challenge the US dollar or challenge fiat or challenge debt-based currency or a debt-based monetary system. Obviously, if you join, the US dollar, to Bitcoin, having Bitcoin be a challenge to those things essentially kind of has to stop. And really, in that situation, you could have Bitcoin enable that type of irresponsible fiscal policy because you could, you would essentially be using it as a sink for hyperinflation at the end of the day.
It is a really interesting frame to think of Bitcoin as a sink for hyperinflation of the US dollar, but I don't know that a lot of people are going to understand what that means. So if you had to say that same thing, but from a different angle, how would you explain to somebody how, one, why is the hyperinflation going to come about? And two, how is it Bitcoin that becomes the sink for that to stop that from becoming a runaway problem?
So essentially, if you were to like hyperinflate the dollar in this type of system, obviously the price of Bitcoin would appreciate as price in US dollars, but it's not, but Bitcoin itself isn't subject to inflation. So the people that hold Bitcoin in that case would really benefit in that type of scenario, but people that hold, dollars, for example, would not necessarily, but there's also this effort to sort of resolve this that aspect of it by bringing stable coins into the equation, which are you know digital dollars, but they're kind of gobbling up US treasuries. And are buying sort of like nation state level amount of US government debt and servicing the debt at the same time. So sort of the Bitcoin dollar system as I understand it. And again, this is Mark Goodwin's work. So again, he can probably explain it a lot better than me and the detailed mechanisms and all of that. But as I understand it, you would have to have sort of these dollar stable coins in the mix as well, as a way to sort of absorb government debt. And even, these things may not be enough to absorb all of the debt that we have. And so there's these efforts right now, this idea of real world asset tokenization. There's this push into tokenizing what is referred to as natural capital or aspects, I guess, major, like even entire ecosystems essentially, and tokenizing them and using that as sort of like, a store of wealth of finite supply. So there's this one effort, for example, that's seeking to tokenize each hectare of the Amazon rainforest. And there's 750 million hectares. So there's a finite supply of this digital asset security that's tied to each hectare of the rainforest. So then you have something else that could in theory be used as a sink for this stuff too, because when it's of a finite supply, it's not subject to inflation, and so you can sort of mitigate the impacts of inflation by having this anti-inflationary thing because of its finite supply as a sink, for the thing that you're creating more of in the case of in the case of dollars.
Okay, that is really, really interesting. I want to walk people through that in my words. Let me know if I go astray. In fact, one thing, I'm going to lay out how I think the dollar hyperinflates, but if you think I get that wrong, please definitely challenge my thinking. So here's what I'm taking away from this. Right now, because of the debt going up like crazy, we are already in a position where the US government is going to spend more just on the interest in the debt than they spend on military spending. Next year, it's projected to be more than Medicare, Medicaid, all of our social programs. And so what's going to end up happening is they will inevitably find themselves in a position where they're going to have to lower rates in order to be able to make good on that debt or default. Defaulting, I think, would be way worse. And so what they'll end up doing is printing money. Now, the problem is printing money, in my words, printing money is straight theft. They are making more of the money so that they can socialize effectively the losses.
The losses, yeah.
Exactly. So everybody has to deal with the losses, but then they can funnel that money into making good on the debt that they've accrued. Okay, so to do that, then you're going to get into this just death spiral of hyperinflating the dollar because you have to keep printing more of it in order to service the debt and deal with all your obligations so that you don't default. So that will effectively drive the worth of the dollar closer and closer to zero. Every Global reserve currency has had this problem. Even if you look at the British pound, it's lost something like 98% of its value over the last 150 years or something. It's absolutely insane. So this is the nature of currencies. And what you need in order to avoid getting clobbered by that, if you're paying attention, is you need an asset that you can go into, that you can store the value of your money. It's why they call it a store of value, that cannot be inflated. And the one that has a lot of cultural attention and energy right now is Bitcoin. That's certainly why I have invested in Bitcoin. I do not trust the government not to just keep printing and printing and printing. But what you're saying is, hey, there's this process called tokenization that we can use to assign ownership to every physical thing of value, such as the Amazon rainforest. And if you own a given hectare of the Amazon rainforest, you know that they aren't going to be making any more of it. So you have something that is a finite supply. You're able to put your value into that. And as long as people value that part of the rainforest, you are good. You have a companion store of wealth to Bitcoin or whatever.
But the side part of this is that in order to ensure the integrity of the hectare on which each unit of token is based, you must surveil the forest. And so there's this whole idea of now creating the internet of forests, putting sensors on every tree and every hectare of the Amazon in order to ensure that no one's messing with it. And this may also at some point include, the indigenous people that live there, because, if 1 hectare has an indigenous tribe and less trees, right, as compared to another hectare that isn't inhabited, which one is more valuable in the eyes of investors, particularly if there's this effort to impose like a carbon market, a global carbon market, which some people like Mark Carney and other prominent, central bankers and other bankers have discussed at length as a alleged solution, to environmental issues in the world. I think that is something that should be talked about as well. And also the idea is to also use satellite surveillance. And so this particular effort to tokenize the Amazon specifically is teamed up with a satellite company called Satellogic. And Satellogic, the chair of the board is Steve Mnuchin, the former Treasury Secretary. And also on the board is a man named Howard Lutnick, who was recently named to be co-chair of Trump's transition team. And he's the longtime head of Cantor Fitzgerald, which is one of the main dealers of U.S. Treasuries, and also very intimately connected to the stablecoin Tether, which is also invested in Satellogic. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what goes on there as it relates to the satellite firm, which is also, in previous reporting I did with Mark Goodwin, who I mentioned earlier for Bitcoin Magazine, they've been involved in sort of this effort to create a carbon market in Latin America that was built on the Bitcoin blockchain specifically, which is something that I think a lot of, at least older school Bitcoiners who are not really into the idea of carbon markets or any of these things would be, quite against. But I think it's something that should definitely be talked about, the idea of, using satellite surveillance to back all of this stuff up, especially with a company like Satellogic that has, the people I mentioned on the board, but also are, vying for U.S. intelligence and military contracts. And the people that created that company are longtime contractors for DARPA and the NSA and U.S. intelligence. So you're going to have this satellite firm, surveilling large swaths of Latin America. If these efforts, one of which is called Green Plus and the other one called One Amazon, go through, you'll essentially have a company that's tied to, for important people that are, as it relates to the U.S. government, former officials, and also people that have historically been U.S. government and intelligence contractors, surveilling your environment from the sky without a national government really having any say in the matter. I think that's quite problematic. And also Tether is behaving rather, making some interesting choices for a stablecoin issue, or I think as well, they've started investing, for example, in brain machine interfaces, brain chips and that sort of thing. And have also, onboarded the FBI and Secret Service onto their platform, and have been, shutting down people's wallets on behalf of, the Treasury's OFAC. And entities like that. So, I think, some of these stablecoin issuers, the prominent ones anyway, are sort of anticipating this kind of system that I discussed earlier, and are sort of embedding themselves with powerful actors that I think ultimately mitigate their ability to be what some people have argued are human rights tools. Some people have said that about stablecoins in the past. But if you're onboarding, one particular government, which very much has a political agenda as it relates to Latin America and other parts of the world, onto your stablecoin, and are freezing, and taking people's money essentially at the behest of that government, and also getting, invested with people that are, at least in the case of a future Trump administration, are likely to have some political connections there as well. I think that's pretty significant.
Yeah, I think that's very fair to say. Let me ask, do you think that the tokenization of the natural world helps or hinders with this, what you called the neo-feudal, or I've heard you refer to it as like a new form of slavery where we have these two very divergent classes? Because when you first started describing it, it sounded kind of awesome. And then by the end, I thought, uh-oh, like maybe this actually creates something really terrible.
Well, okay, let's take the case of, the Green Plus program, which claims to sort of tokenize and turn into carbon credits protected areas throughout Latin America. So in those cases, the carbon credits aren't given to the locals or the local governments to trade and make money off of and put back into their communities. It's going through third parties that are not based in those countries, and the money for the people there go into a particular fund that isn't managed by any people that live there. It's managed by, well, they haven't really been open about it, but a guy from one of the biggest insurance companies in the world, Locked In, is ostensibly the head of it. And they would decide when there would be certain allotments of that money, and that money can only be spent on projects that this particular group running Green Plus, that again isn't based in Latin America, approves of. So in that case, you're sort of choosing how the money can be spent. You're framing it publicly as for the benefit of the environment and for the benefit of these local people. But in reality, you're deciding what they can and can't fund. And some of the stuff that, their partners and whatever are tied to a lot of the same, foreign oligarchs, like the Rockefeller Foundation or the Gates Foundation, or entities, like that go back to some of these, very, wealthy families. Ultimately, it's initiatives run by NGOs that those organizations fund, which ultimately doesn't necessarily work in the best interests of these local people who are, poised to surrender these protected areas, supposedly to protect them by generating carbon credits. But the carbon credits are going to be traded by people abroad, and the decisions about how that money is spent is being made by people who are abroad, not about the locals. So it sort of seems to me like a way to, frame a project that's going to make certain people a lot of money under very different terms than what is actually going to happen. It seems more likely to disenfranchise rather than empower locals, but is being framed sort of as a planetary necessity because of the whole, climate change thing, right? So we have to act now to do this stuff. And so there's, this pressure being placed through that rhetoric on people to comply with these types of things, particularly in Latin America is a big focus of that now. But I think, as it's been, played out in practice, that really isn't the case. And the particular group that I mentioned earlier that's doing this in the Amazon, which is called One Amazon, entered into contractual agreements with this indigenous community called the Shuar, I believe, that live in the Amazon. And it was framed to them as being great. And then they actually went and read the contract after they signed it and realized that it dramatically favored One Amazon over their interests, and then voted to cancel the agreement. Right. So these guys kind of have a history, at least these actors that I've mentioned, of sort of going in and framing their stuff, making a sales pitch to locals that it's going to be great for them. And then when it's not in practice, the locals are trying to get out of it. So that should really tell you a lot about what's going on here, I think.
Okay. Do you by any chance know the Cosine theorem?
No.
It's very interesting. I'm just beginning to explore it, but one of what I'm trying to figure out is the thing you're talking about. Is it the necessary outcome? So when I think about the take Africa and the natural resources that they have, and does that have to be a point of exploitation, or could that be a point where they're able to grow their industries from the ground up? So for instance, if you're just selling off your cobalt or whatever, yeah, you're going to be in a really bad position because you're going to get effectively taken advantage of. The real money is in building the products, the batteries, whatever, that are downstream of mining that element. If, however, you build the industry in your own country and you say that we're a tremendous source of cobalt, or in the example of what we're talking about, you have this Amazon rainforest, is it necessary, just a fact of the way the economic system is set up, that you will end up getting exploited if you do this? Or if they were smart, could they put in legislation that says, okay, we're actually going to assign a value to all of these different items, the rainforest, the whatever. And now, according to the Cosine, if I'm saying that correctly, theorem, it says basically the reason that we end up with these imbalances where like people pollute into a river, and now you have a company that's able to make a ton of money because they can force us all to pay a cost for the pollution, but they get to reap all the benefits. If instead you assign an owner to the river, now all of a sudden the owner of that river knows exactly how much damage is being done, and they can go to the company and say, you owe me this much money because you are injuring this asset that I own that has a cost. So it becomes this, it's basically a statement of, without clear property rights, then people get away with things like the tragedy of the commons, where they're able to push their pollution downstream and reap economic benefits from it. So as I was hearing you say the story, that was what came to mind, was like, well, hold on a second. If you actually assign a value to this stuff, to the rainforest, just to stick with one example, now suddenly the rainforest has clear property rights. And if the property rights are clear, as long as those people have not signed a stupid deal, as long as the property rights are clear and, I'm going to use a terrible word right now, just, I don't have a better word in this moment, but if they are clear and just, now all of a sudden it's like, we should be able to get into a position where the local people or whomever are able to capture an accurate amount of value, to know who is deleteriously impacting their ownership. And so if the Cosine theory is correct, that may actually have a positive benefit. Now, I am barely beginning to understand this theorem. So for anybody that knows it better, by all means, drop something in the comments about what I'm not understanding. Very early in the journey of getting knowledgeable about that. But anyway, to really be succinct with the question, do you think it is a fundamental nature of our economic system that will become a point of exploitation? Or could that, if structured correctly, be a boon for any local region that has a natural asset?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the powers that are affecting sort of this natural capital agenda right now are inherently predatory institutions. And so I think their interest is in exploiting, which has been historically what has happened to Latin America in the colonial and post-colonial era. And I think this perhaps may be a more creative way of sort of dressing up the same game to make it look different.
What
Um,
is the game?
well, I think what the goal here is to sort of financialize and monetize what previously have been the global commons. Um, so, for example, there was this effort that was spearheaded by a Rockefeller Foundation connected group called the Intrinsic Exchange Group. They partnered with the New York Stock Exchange to create this new asset class and asset vehicle called the Natural Asset Corporation. And basically how these NACs are said to work, at least as far as the architects of it have said, is that this group goes and identifies a natural asset that nobody owns, and then they sort of have an ICO and sell shares in that, and then work on generating profit for their shareholders, and then allegedly will use that money to towards conserving the asset and all of that. But conserving the asset, for example, could mean not letting anyone or any locals go near it. And these natural asset corporations could go and, I don't know, claim on a lake in Chile, for example, and say no one can use it. But what if a bunch of local people fish in it and aren't necessarily damaging the lake? But, at least in Chile and Argentina and maybe other Latin American countries, water, even if it's, a lake or a river that touches a privately owned property, that's, part of the commons. So the intrinsic exchange group frames this natural asset corporation as creating a whole new asset class that dwarfs the existing asset classes we use today. And they referred to that as nature's economy and as the opportunity in unlocking nature's economy. So really, it's a way to create this huge, in my opinion, massive asset class that will allow them to continue really what is the Wall Street casino, allow them to continue their bad behavior into the new era, but are just going to be sort of taking ownership of natural features, and making these corporations around them, and then using them really essentially however they like, because in theory, you could have a natural asset corporation and through all these carbon markets and all these other mechanisms that are being created, you can buy offsets or other things to sort of justify whatever you want to do to any sort of land you take ownership of, and sort of frame, this whole system as benefiting the environment. But really, I don't really think it is that, because a lot of these natural capital things have been developed by JP Morgan, or people like Mark Carney, who was a former banker of the head of the Bank of England, head of the Bank of Canada, and also helped cover up the HSBC drug cartel money laundering scandal, among other things. And these are the kind of people that are sort of designing these supposedly sustainable development systems, but a lot of it involves debt politics, as it relates to global South economies. This idea in the Sustainable Development Goals of having sustainable debt levels and all of this stuff, and how debt is an important part of financing the Sustainable Development Goals, and how a lot of these ideas of financializing nature, they say it'll give nature monetary value, but it also allows nature to be turned into financial instruments, that in the hands of these predatory financial institutions could just essentially become fodder for their casino at the end of the day. And I think that's not really a good thing. So I think we should look at the history of these institutions and not necessarily, believe at face value what they say of, this is good for the environment and whatever. I don't really think that's necessarily the case. If you look at, groups like the Nature Conservancy, for example, that are sort of a pioneer in this field. They've been intimately connected with Wall Street for a very, very long time. Henry Paulson, who I mentioned earlier, the former Goldman Sachs guy that was head of the Treasury Department when the 08, 07, 08 crash started, was chairman of the Nature Conservancy for a long time. And they have a lot of involvement with JP Morgan people. They're pioneering this whole idea of the debt for nature swap, on that if countries implement plans the Nature Conservancy designs for land management, for example, they'll be able to restructure part of their debt and all of this. It's sort of, I would argue, a way to use the huge debt load that Latin America has been saddled with through their relationships with entities like the IMF and the World Bank. A way to sort of offer them an out, quote unquote, but it's not necessarily an out. It's sort of a way into this new game, I guess you could say. And so I'm sort of concerned about it in that sense. And I'm also concerned that a lot of these same entities too, if you're going to turn like the natural world into a commodity, a lot of these banks that are involved, like JP Morgan, for example, have a track record of manipulating commodities and engaging in a lot of, financial criminality that they've never really been held accountable for, aside from, maybe some multi-million-dollar fines. But when you look at, how much money these banks have, I mean, those fines are nothing to them, especially when, the financial criminality being prosecuted creates profits 10 times the amount of the fine. I mean, it was worth it for them at the end of the day. They have no incentive to change their behavior. So I think for us to believe that they're all of a sudden altruistically concerned about people in the global south and the planet and the environment, I think is honestly kind of naive of us. And I think we should consider that perhaps this is there's different motives at work here.
All right, I want to drill into this idea of organized crime, intelligence agencies getting together, financial, criminal activity. Help me understand what's going on. Where does the conjoining of organized crime and politics sit exactly, and what do intelligence agencies have to do with it?
Yeah, so I wrote a whole book about this called One Nation Under Blackmail. It's divided into 2 volumes. So originally, the story, I started writing the book trying to make sense of the Jeffrey Epstein scandal because I was reporting on that at the time of his arrest in 2019. Um, and was trying to figure out what was going on there because I realized very quickly that Epstein obviously had a lot of support behind him in order to be able to do what he was doing and not really face any meaningful consequences. And so I started looking sort of at this network behind him and his affiliations and focus a lot of my work, not so much on Epstein after his first arrest in 2007 or so, but really what he was doing in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. And in going back far enough, I, sort of fleshed out what became volume 1 of the book, which is sort of tracing this particular network that he inhabited back to these events that happened in first in World War II and then later the immediate post World War II era. And in World War II, I guess you could say it started with something called Operation Underworld, which is where I believe the Office of Naval Intelligence made a covert alliance with organized crime, specifically the National Crime Syndicate. So the National Crime Syndicate was really a combination of Charles Lucky Luciano of the Italian Mafia and Meyer Lansky of the Jewish mob. They sort of came together and created what they called the National Crime Syndicate and Murder Inc. and all of this years prior. And in New York City specifically, made major inroads in essentially taking over the Democratic Party, Luciano in particular, and they did this by taking over the unions in New York first, which was the historical base of the Democratic Party, and then a few threatening threats were made to certain choice people in order for them to secure sort of, I guess, control over that particular party in New York City. And obviously, it seems like this model was replicated and expanded in other mob hotspots throughout the country with people allied with these 2 particular figures. So those particular figures teamed up with the Office of Naval Intelligence in World War II, ostensibly to protect U.S. docks from would-be German saboteurs and things like that. And so essentially this is a documented thing. And so I use that as a starting point. But from that point on, you see all these other affiliations of the intelligence complex as it was developing, because the CIA, for example, was created in the late 40s after World War II. But you see a lot of overlap with organized crime there too. Like a lot of people from the National Crime Syndicate, for example, were used as CIA assassins abroad, among other things. And you have a lot of it's sort of this symbiotic relationship, it seemed, sort of developed between these organized crime figures and then, what would become the modern U.S. intelligence apparatus. And so you see sort of the CIA after its formation, sort of getting into what had traditionally been mob rackets, like drug trafficking, arms trafficking, for example, and also things like sex blackmail, which is something that the mob had perfected previously, and the CIA and of course other intelligence agencies as well went on to use to their benefit for a very long time. And I think honestly why they would develop this relationship makes sense when you look at the fact that a lot of the people in the early CIA and its precursor in World War II, the Office of Strategic Services, were very intimately connected to Wall Street. So very much interested in markets and new markets, and specifically protected markets, which I guess you could argue a sort of racket ultimately is at the end of the day. So I think that's sort of where it really started. And I think this particular alliance, as I point out in my book, and I just have a lot of detail and go over a lot of different scandals and administrations, is something that has been a pretty consistent theme in U.S. history from that point on. And I think it very much has influenced where we are today in very significant ways.
All right. What does Jeffrey Epstein reveal about the inner workings of the elites, basically the global elites coming together, leveraging, like you talked about, sex blackmail? What does it reveal about that underworld that's just out of sight from the average person?
Yeah, I think what it reveals is that the way we think power operates, or the way we've been taught power operates in the United States and really around the world, is very different than how it actually works. A lot of it is about behind door deal making, and it's about markets, it's creating markets. And sometimes, it's about generating artificial or fake demand for the products of those markets, maybe if no one wants them, or, allowing the state to engage in clandestine or illegal illicit markets. And so they're participating in making all the money, but, no one else is involved in those rackets because it's otherwise illegal. And I think a lot of it, I think we've sort of been fed a fairy tale version of American history for those that are interested in looking into, there's lots of authors over the years, I'm only really following in their footsteps, that have pointed out that there are a lot of times there's been deeper things going on to events that maybe when we learn about certain major events in American history in schools, perhaps there's a lot more, they've been able to show, and I have hoped to show in my book too, that there have been these other corollaries going on as well, that explain a lot more effectively, what we have experienced in the past 100 or so years of American history and what it means for the now. And I think as far as it relates to Jeffrey Epstein, I think the sex blackmail and sex trafficking thing is really one of several things that he was involved with doing, and I think keeping the focus on those specifically has intentionally distracted from other things he was involved in, like currency speculation. It seems like he was involved in sort of financial hitman activity, and sort of collapsing and pumping foreign currencies around the world. He was involved in efforts to manipulate the tax system, setting up major nonprofits in ways that were in this gray area of legal and not legal. In the 1980s, he claimed to be hiding and finding looted money, i.e., stolen money, for the most powerful people in the world. So that obviously refers to someone who is very intimately aware of the shadow banking system, money laundering, where financial criminals would hide their assets. People that worked with him in the 1980s have alleged that he had a relationship with BCCI, which is a very controversial bank of that era that later sort of collapsed in the early 1990s, but wasn't only a bank that worked for that had intelligence agencies and drug cartels and all sorts of other people as clients, but it was also, according to the U.S. Senate report on BCCI, was sex trafficking prepubescent children to elites of the United Arab Emirates, and that was never properly investigated either. So there is a lot of very brazen criminality that goes on in the upper echelons of power. And I think we've been led to believe that it doesn't. And a lot of that is because these powerful people have a lot of money to pump into public relations, and have also for a really long time tried to manipulate the information people see and don't see. And I think that continues now into the modern era. And I think, there hasn't really been a lot of scrutiny about these other aspects of what Epstein was up to. And there also hasn't been really any scrutiny at all of the person who we know is his main patron, which is Leslie Wexner, who I believe is still the richest man in Ohio, and a major retail billionaire in the United States. And sort of the framing we've been given is that, well, Epstein is dead and Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison, and so this type of activity now stops. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think, as I've labored to show in my work on the Epstein case, that Epstein was not an anomaly, and was really, if anything, really middle management. For this particular network I'm referring to, that has, for a long time in connection with intelligence agencies, and other intelligence agencies and other groups engaged in things like illegal arms trafficking, illegal technology transfer to ostensible U.S. adversary states, and all sorts of other scandalous things that have, been pushed under the rug for a very long time. But if you go and look for the sources, including, from congressional records and things that are completely irrefutable, It's very clear that this type of criminality has gone on for a very, very long time. And I think more people need to be aware of it, so we're, a little more aware of what we're actually dealing with as it relates, to the government and some of these other institutions.
What mental paradigm do you use to make sense of all of this? Is this will to power? Is this humans are just animals and they can't transcend their urges? And so governments and shadow agencies leverage people's sexual deviancy to get control of them? Like what mental model? Because you talk about a part of the world I have no interface with. And so it makes me feel like I'm sort of skimming across the surface of the matrix. What mental model do you use to make this all make sense?
As far as it relates to humans, I think honestly what it says more than anything else is that most humans are good people, but they're also very trusting. And they've been too trusting in people who we have enough information on the books by now to know that a lot of the people with extreme amounts of power in our world today are not trustworthy at all, but we continue trusting them. And I think, that's very problematic. And I think the fact that a lot of these actors are very, historically have done very dark things. I think a lot of people prefer not to think about it. And prefer to sort of have a block on it and just not interact with it at all and continue living their lives that are completely divorced from that world. But unfortunately, that world is having now more than ever an increased effect on our actual livelihoods and potentially seeking to lead us into sort of this new neo-feudal paradigm that I mentioned earlier. And so I think people need to be a lot less trusting of these particular people and of the fronts or the politicians that are, rolled out to sell these agendas to us, and that we need to rely more on the people in our communities, our friend groups, and our families that we know are good, and build resilient local communities with them. Because if you like yourself and myself are concerned about an economic crisis coming down the road, it's very unlikely, if you look at historical precedent, that the government is going to actually do anything to save you, or that Wall Street will do anything to save you. It's much more likely that you'll be in a better spot to face that crisis if you build something local that can provide resilience for you and your family and your friends and your community in the face of that crisis. So I think we a lot of times Americans and other countries as well are sort of told that as long as we get the right guy in the White House, he'll magically fix everything, or all we need to do to ensure our country goes in the right direction is vote once every 4 years. I think it should be clear to people now more than ever that that is really very mistaken, especially now that we have two people running for office in the main parties that have both been in power before, that have been in the executive branch before, and we've seen what they've done. And I think people should focus a lot more on policy agendas rather than just rhetoric, because at the end of the day, most politicians, when they campaign, it's a sales pitch. And a lot of those people don't keep their promises once they get into office. And that's true of both Trump and the Biden Kamala crowd. And I think people need to take more individual responsibility for their lives and stop waiting for some sort of savior to magically get in the White House to make everything better. So I think we've been led to believe, again, by being very trusting, that we don't have any agency to make things better. I think we absolutely do. And there are a lot more of us than there are of them. And there's power in numbers. And if people would organize on the local level, starting with making sure your friends and family are taken care of, because especially if you anticipate things are just going to get very crazy, which seems increasingly likely, whether it's in an economic sense or a social sense, making sure you have some sort of stability or network to fall back on, I think is a very, very, very important.
Okay. So if we know that people are being too trusting, and if we know that this stuff is happening right before us, what specifically do we need to be vigilant for, vote against, whatever, however you want to think about it, that if we remain blind to will lead to this new slave class?
So I think we should focus on specific policy agendas that are meant to take us there. And I think the cornerstone of those is the effort to create an all-encompassing digital ID that will determine what you can and can't access in your life. I would argue, and I wrote reports of at the time during COVID-19, and others did as well, that sort of the vaccine passport was a trial run for this digital ID vision that's being implemented essentially globally and going to be rolled out over the next 2 years or so at the global level. And the idea of having a lot of the surveillance sucked up on you being linked to the digital ID, having it determine having your medical records in there, having your telecom in there, your social media account, really all of your aspect of life in this centralized digital ID is very problematic, especially if we saw during COVID, if you didn't have the right, if you didn't get the vaccine, for example, you weren't allowed into places. It restricted your freedom of movement. Digital ID has the ability to restrict not just your freedom of movement, but really your access to everything, including information based on the blueprints that are out there by the public-private partnerships and associations that are developing it, like ID 2020, for example. And then there's the whole idea of linking this intimately with a digital wallet that, again, would have some sort of programmable, surveillable, and seizable currency, which, again, as I said earlier, has major implications for financial freedom and financial privacy. I think we need to focus a lot on those in particular because a lot of consciousness was generated about those policy agendas during the COVID era and the risks of them. And, unfortunately, we're in a situation now globally where you have people both on the left and the right marketing these policy agendas under very different metrics that they think their base will be most receptive to. So in the case of, Donald Trump, for example, he's calling for a biometric entry exit system as a way to tackle illegal immigration. A campaign lawyer of his went on a podcast a few months ago saying that biometric facial recognition would be a way to stomp out the voter ID or the voter fraud issue and institute voter ID. And you can support voter ID, but why can't we just have physical driver's license or the type of IDs people have always had? Why does it have to be a biometric facial recognition thing? And unfortunately, Trump's vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, is very intimately connected to a man named Peter Thiel, who funds a lot of companies that are, for example, building the virtual border wall or building facial recognition systems that are being sent to law enforcement, some of which brag about, having it been used to send people that were at the Capitol on January 6, 2021 to prison, among other things. And it's very likely that these type of policies would also be implemented, if Kamala wins, for example, too, but going to be sold under different metrics as well to her base. But a lot of the same backers behind her, like Reid Hoffman, for example, envision the same type of policy coming to fruition. And I think we should focus on stopping those policy agendas in particular. And it's important to keep in mind, too, as far as programmable, surveillable, seizable money goes, as I said earlier, it's not just CBDCs. This can also be, that same regime can be implemented with stable coins. And I think if we focus on these policy agendas, which are central to this larger agenda, and say we don't want these things, and we plan with our friends and family who are like-minded how we're going to opt out of those systems, I think that could be really powerful and affect real change.
Okay, so I want to get to how we opt out, but first I want to better understand, do you think the government has too much power right now?
Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean,
Do
there's so
you
many aspects of that. I don't even know what is the best detail to drill down on. But I guess I would say that when Bill Barr was Attorney General under Trump, he implemented a program called DEEP, which essentially created this framework for the DOJ to begin pre-crime prosecutions. And this whole idea that you can prosecute people or arrest them for social media posts. And that's happened a few times in the US since then. But also more recently in the UK, you have that same policy being rolled out there as well, where people are being handed down 20-month prison sentences for social media posts and
That
things
is
like that.
crazy.
And that's very problematic. And so around that same time that Bill Barr did that, after the El Paso Walmart shooting, Trump called on social media platforms to profile their users and try and pick out potential shooters before they could act. So sort of calling on tech giants to develop some sort of pre-crime functionality. And even though that didn't end up happening, that's very problematic. Maybe you could argue that Trump did it because it was a crisis and that was his response, but that's not good, and that's very bad for freedom, and it's very Orwellian. And this is policy that is also, being promoted by aspects of the Democrats in the United States, and also, like as I mentioned, labor in Britain with Keir Starmer is sending people to prison for social media posts. And there's actually this broader effort that involves, U.S. intelligence agencies and the FBI and the Secret Service, Britain, and Israeli intelligence as well. It's housed at the World Economic Forum. It's called the Partnership Against Cybercrime. And they're attempting to label speech as a form of cybercrime. So if you publish alleged misinformation online, you could be considered a cyber criminal under some of the policy papers that they have published in the past, which I think is very concerning. And they're arguing that digital ID should be a requisite for internet access also, because that way everything you read and consume online and everything you post online would be tied to your government issued digital ID. So that's really creating a framework for unprecedented surveillance of our online lives and online activity. And then when you add the whole push into pre-crime that has been going on for a very long time and both parties have advanced, then it doesn't really matter if you have done something wrong or not. If the algorithm determines that you may commit a crime in the future because of what you've posted or said or how you've reacted online, that leads us into a very, very, very dark and problematic place. And there really isn't a lot of understanding or consensus about these issues. But a lot of it comes down to, again, us being so trusting with thinking that the data that we put out online isn't going to be used against us or isn't going to be misused by some of these entities who access it. And that includes, government contractors like Palantir, for example, which gets a lot of contracts regardless of who's in office. And they have profiled people on behalf of the CIA, regular Americans, based on their online activity for decades now. And there's really not a lot of discussion about it. And I think I don't know, people should be aware of this stuff and aware of what the government's doing, and look for things that we can do to opt out of these systems as much as possible.
All right. Talk to me about that. How do we weaken the government's power over us?
Well, I think at this point, a lot of it has to do with Silicon Valley and our dependence on products of certain Silicon Valley behemoths. So a lot of the biggest companies in Silicon Valley also double as military and intelligence contractors and give our data quite freely to them when they should not. And again, if we become so dependent on a suite of products, all of which, if all of those companies have these same ties, for example, maybe we can use some Google and some Microsoft products, whatever, but if they're all intelligence military contractors at the end of the day and we can't live our lives without them, then we can be manipulated to do things to maintain access to those products in ways that might be very damaging to human freedom, among other things. So I think it's important to look for open source or different alternatives and look for companies or operating systems or whatever that don't have those types of relationships with the military and intelligence communities. I think people should also consider spending less time online and maybe a little more time offline, remembering what it's like to hang out with real people and build community in the real world. Because I think specifically in the COVID era, when a lot of us were forced to be online a lot more than before, because of lockdowns and other things, it may have been a little easier to have forgotten what that's like at the end of the day. But I think if you can be as self-sufficient as possible, not in, of course, from the tech perspective, that's hard because not everyone can develop their own software, but there are things you can use that, if you're upset about Google censorship or something like that on YouTube, but you're continuing to use Google products all the time, you're not really providing an incentive for the company to change, and you're freely giving it giving your data up to it, and it's a contractor with these aspects of the U.S. military and things like that, or at least historically has been. I believe they still do have contracts, but really, you know, Silicon Valley in the military and intelligence really have fused operations in a lot of significant ways. And you can argue also that a lot of, intelligence agencies had early involvement in some of the biggest Silicon Valley companies as well. There's an alleged CIA involvement with the origins of Google, Oracle, and some other significant companies as well. And then, of course, you have the involvement of people like Jeffrey Epstein with Microsoft in the 1990s, and some other things that haven't really been, reported on significantly, but probably should be. So I think, that's one way we could opt out and not be so dependent on particular companies that have those ties. But I think also, like, there's a lot of other ways to be resilient, learning a skill that other people don't have that might be useful in a time of crisis. Building a store of knowledge, because if internet censorship gets worse, if you have offline knowledge that will be useful to you in a time of crisis stored on hard drives when you can't access the internet, that seems like it might be helpful. Learning to grow your food, or investing in someone in your community that can grow food and will grow food for you. There's a lot of different things that people can do to try and make themselves more self-sufficient, because the more dependent we are either on these companies or on the government, we do have less agency in those cases. And I think we really need to remember that we do have agency. We've been outsourcing it. We've been giving it away to other people who don't have our best interests at heart. And we as a society need to learn to take that back as much as possible.
All right. When people tell me I need to start thinking about making my own food, then I'm like, whoa, we are planning for a catastrophe here at this point. So in a near-term timeline, let's say the next 3 to 5 years, how bad do you expect it to get on a scale of I can keep going to the grocery store to I better have my own farm? And how far are you going in your own life to plan for wherever you think we are going to be on that spectrum?
Well, I feel a little weird making these kind of predictions, because obviously no one knows exactly what's going to happen. But I think it's better to be over prepared than under prepared. That's just my personal opinion. And I know not everyone feels that way, but at the very least, as someone that lives in South America, like, I've talked to a decent amount of people from Argentina that lived through the economic collapse there in 2001. And a lot of what I've heard is that mental preparedness is very, very important. So maybe you don't have the resources to really prep or prepare for some sort of major crisis, but you can think through at least what you would do and have some sort of plan if things do get bad. Because when people don't have any sort of plan at all, or any sort of framework with how to deal with any significant crisis, they panic, and people tend to make poor decisions when they are in fear and panicking, right? So I think there's a whole spectrum of, how much you could prepare or how little. And really, regardless of your economic means, there's something everyone could do to be a little more prepared. But at the end of the day, whatever crisis comes, however bad it is, the solution from the government or its private sector partners is going to be increased surveillance and increased control over our lives. And if you do not want that, you should become as self-sufficient as you possibly can with you and your community, because it's very likely that whatever the next crisis is, the solution that will be offered is going to come with a lot of caveats to it. Whether it's, programmable, surveillable money that you'll be onboarded to not lose all the access to the dollars that were previously in your banking account, or any other, number of things. We have to regulate the internet because of cybercrime. Now you need a digital ID to access the internet and stuff like that. There's a lot of things that could potentially happen, and a lot of solutions we could potentially be sold. But at the end of the day, if you look at what's happened in the post 9/11 era with nearly every crisis, it's usually more control for them, less freedom for us. And I think we need to be vigilant about that and think about how, in the face of any crisis that comes forward, how Can we be more sufficient and not so dependent on, maybe a solution that the government would offer, but would come with us being forced to surrender more of our freedom, and, more of our actual security, because a lot of times when we've been offered that, that trade-off, we haven't really received increased security. It hasn't increased regular American wealth. It hasn't benefited the little person, but it has, benefited, the surveillance panopticon and a lot of other of these things that have been, built out in the post 9/11 era. And so I think, you know, maybe it will get really bad. Maybe it will be a little less bad, more of a blip. Who knows? It seems like it's gearing up, at least economically, to be quite bad. But these guys too have a lot of ways of rigging markets, rigging market responses. So I think they'll try and mitigate or have it play out however they think it will benefit them the most once that crisis emerges, right? But
Let me ask, do
I
you
don't know.
think
I mean,
that
it could get really bad, and I'm again prefer to be over prepared. So like in my own personal life, I'm gearing up to be food self-sufficient and have some sort of form of off-grid power. Where I live, there was a storm a few weeks ago and I lost power for 13 days.
whoa.
So, you know, sometimes stuff like that can happen. And so even if it's not a major economic crisis or some other, government produced crisis, it's always good to be prepared. And in this sort of landscape that's developing, I think the more self-sufficient you are, the more you will have agency and be in more control of your life. And I think that really could benefit everybody personally.
Now, this may just be the sort of arrogance that seeps into you when you were born and raised in America, but I think of South America as being less governmentally stable than the US. Would you say that you have more or less freedom in South America than we have here in the US?
Well, it's interesting because really a lot of South American governments have been unstable at times, but a lot of that has you could arguably trace back um, to really perhaps US government involvement historically in the continent. Latin America and Central America were subjected to a ton of coups sponsored by US intelligence. And there's a lot of US intelligence and US government manipulation of national governments down here that have tended to cause problems that sometimes seethe and then explode a decade later or something. So, it's very complicated to really try and explain some more governments are more stable than others, perhaps. I live in Chile, which is traditionally viewed as one of the more stable governments in South America, but was also subjected to a very, totalitarian dictatorship that was backed by U.S. intelligence, for a very long time. And a lot of complications have also come downwind of that, and there's also political division here, just like there is in the United States. And I think regardless of who is president of Chile, they tend to it's really about, at least at this point, balancing either is the US going to dominate their administration or is China. It's really not so much about what am I going to do in charge of my sovereign nation? It's balancing the interests of two competing global superpowers at the end of the day. As far as it goes to normal life here, I definitely like it. It's different than the US. I feel like I do have a lot of freedom, but things can be really complicated. The COVID response here was much more draconian and freedom limiting than a lot of places in the US. And a lot of the things that I've been talking about today are really global issues. And it's really something that's being foisted on the global population. And I don't really think there's any government in the world that isn't on board with some of these policy agendas, at least in some way. I know Chile certainly is, but as far as, money goes, for someone on the income I make, Chile is a lot more affordable. I have two young kids, healthcare, babysitting, school costs, all of that is much more affordable here than if I was in the US. Actually, if I was in the US instead of here because of a health issue with my 2-year-old, I probably would be saddled with decades of medical debt if I was in the US. And here, thankfully, I'm not. So, I have my reasons for being here, but I don't think it's necessarily what everyone should do. Like, if you want to prepare for whatever's coming in the US or another country, it's a very individual decision, but I really recommend doing a lot of research. And if you plan to go to another country, please visit it before you decide to move there. Because I have met people that have not really done that and have regretted it. But really, I think at the end of the day, what's really important is to have people you know and care about and can trust when things get crazy around you. Like, that network, whether you're in the US or South America or really anywhere, is likely to be, the most important thing to keep yourself in a better situation if things get really, rocky externally.
All right, let me see if I can get a barometer for just how dark you think the future is going to be. Do you think that whatever calamity, crisis befalls us in the future, will it be just a thing that happened that people take advantage of, meaning the government is a power grab, or will it be an engineered crisis that they ensure we encounter so that they can grab more power?
Hmm. It's really hard to say, but I think, as far as the economy goes, it's a mathematical inevitability that this debt monstrosity will hit a wall at some point, right? So something has to happen there. There has to be some sort of major change for the US government to get out of that problem. And there's a lot of other issues that have been going on in the economy for some time, and that's why you've had people after '08, looking at the numbers and being like, economic collapse this year, and it didn't happen because all these other all these I mean, the when you have powerful people in finance and also in the government, able to make markets behave certain ways, you can sort of kick the can down the road longer than it normally would if they weren't doing those things. So I think at some point there is going to be some sort of event that happens. And I think the goal, as I said earlier, is to at least make people scared enough that they would acquiesce to this advent of programmable, surveillable money, whether it's a stable coin or a CBDC, and be like, yeah, I'll take that because the alternative is too bad, like losing all of my money and purchasing power, something like that. But that the way that sort of phenomenon could play out could be a short-term thing or a protracted crisis. It's honestly really hard to know. But if you're like me and you have a red line of no programmable, surveillable, seizable money for me, thank you, it's very important to think about how you would avoid that if that type of crisis comes out and that's offered to you as the only alternative to losing all of your wealth.
Whitney, this has been amazing. I cannot thank you enough for your time. Where can people follow along with you?
So my website is unlimitedhangout.com. You can find all my stuff there. You can support my work there. And I would please encourage you to sign up for my newsletter there because I've had a lot of manipulation of past interviews and content by bots and other things. When you search my name in YouTube, it's all interviews I haven't given and people clipping up
Whoa.
out of context things I've said. Yes, it's very unfortunate. But if you want access to what I'm actually saying and the content I'm actually producing and all of that, I would encourage you to go directly to the source, to my website, unlimitedhangout.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining me today. Everybody out there, if you have not already, please be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Peace. If you like this conversation, check out this episode to learn more.
We are being naive, not at least publicly entertaining the possibility that our antagonists abroad would take advantage of our famous lack of security. And you're going to see why we have to talk about genocide. Somebody has to open these topics if we are